Good evening. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. I am live again with Stephen Boyce because apparently I can't quit him. Why can't I quit you, Stephen? What's up with that?
Because we constantly get hounded and responded to and misrepresented. So I guess we're just going to do this for eternity.
I have had a great month. I've been responding to everyone and enjoying it all so much. Like, it has been such a fun month, I have to admit. And I'm like, let's do this again next month. I'm having a ball. So, all right, everyone. So Stephen is back on my channel because our good friend Paulogia, or as he's known by people who can't pronounce his name, Paulogia, responded to us on, once again, traditional gospel authorship. And we argue that traditional authorship is right. The gospels do go back to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That doesn't mean we believe that Matthew went into his private study, wrote the gospel of Matthew, and went out without working with scribes or other early Christians. But we do argue for traditional authorship. Paulogia recently responded arguing against traditional authorship and got a lot of stuff to say on the video. We're not going to go through everything. Most of the main points are towards the end that we really want to hit, because it really seems like Paul wanted us to respond, because Stephen, he kept throwing questions at you.
That's crazy.
So I was like, I guess we got to do a live because he's got so many questions for you. You need to clarify so much, because I don't know. It just seems like he really wanted a response the way he did his video.
Yeah, there was, in my opinion, he actually represented me well. He was following along with my arguments, and then he would try to force a conclusion that I wasn't making by saying I was actually agreeing with him or making his point. And at the end of the day, I was like, no, actually, you're missing my point. We're together for about 75%, but where we land that plane is in two different places, and they have to be distinguished and clarified in some of these, which we'll go through, I'm sure. But I mean, for the most part, he actually did represent what I was saying, mostly to an accurate level. And then he would just make a conclusion that I wasn't making, and saying that my statements were actually agreeing with his conclusion, which they were not agreeing with his conclusion.
Yeah, there was a lot of issues like that where it really just seemed like he was sort of missing the point. However, the whole video with his main conclusion, I was fine with it. Like, his main conclusion was he's not convinced of traditional authorship. Fine.
Okay.
When I've debated, done like live debates arguing for God's existence, sometimes my opponent, like Matt Dillhunt, will be like, well, I'm not convinced. And my response is always, I don't care. Because at the end of the day, I'm offering what I think is the best explanation of the data. This is the best inference. If you're not convinced, fine, but don't tell me you have a better explanation of the data, a better inference, a more complete and coherent worldview. Because if you're not going to offer a rival hypothesis, fine. If Paulogia in this video was arguing, no, it's far more likely they were originally anonymous, and then the titles were added in the 2nd century, that'd be a rival hypothesis, which it seems like he was arguing in the past, but he doesn't seem like he's doing that anymore, unless I'm missing something. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt that maybe we missed something.
It does feel like he shifted a little bit.
Yeah,
doesn't it feel like he shifted from the original video he did with the 4 guys, and he did a really good job on that? It seems like he shifted to almost say, like, so that's what I'm saying. I don't know if he was agreeing with me to the point where he was actually willing to change. And maybe when I'm on his program next week, I can ask him, like, so did you shift your position a little bit because you were staunchly against any eyewitness activity at all? And it seemed like you're willing to concede some of the arguments we were making and not even fight against them anymore. And if that's the case, we did our job. But I don't know if that's the case. And maybe I'll ask him when I'm on his program next week.
Yeah. And so let me just add some context there. Just can someone let me know in the chat? It might be your mic, Stephen. It just seems like it's like glitching a lot. So it seems like you're coming in segments. And it might be my headphones, or it could be yours. So if anyone in the chat, let me know if you can hear Stephen just fine, or if it's just my headphones acting up. Either way, we'll get it fixed. So just let me know about that. But so what happened is we all saw the video and we were like, okay, that's his conclusion. Fine. Do we even want to do a response? And then we said, yeah, I guess we could clarify some things here and just note that your position. And then like you had talked about going on Paul's channel. And so I'd said, okay, well, what would be better? Would it be better for you just to go on, or should you come on my channel, clarify your position, clarify what we're actually arguing, and then you go on with, so Paul has better context for the discussion you guys are planning to have. So for those who don't know, Paul and Stephen may have a discussion soon. And so what we thought would be better would be for Stephen to come on. We'll look at Paul's video, clarify some things, respond to some things. Again, not everything. And then that'll hopefully create a more fruitful and better conversation when you talk to Paul directly.
Yeah, and that'll be Monday, next Monday, by the way. We actually did nail down a time on that. So it'll be next Monday. About the same time as right now. And it sounds like, I think everybody said that they can hear us both pretty good.
Yeah, it sounds like my headphones are just acting up. So I'm going to take them out and put them back in while I just go through a couple things here. Thank you, N.A. Odessa, for gifting 5 Inspiring Philosophy memberships. Those are randomly distributed, I'm told. Thank you, Anthony, for becoming a channel member. Much appreciated. You'll get access, as with all channel members, to thank you, Eddie Baker, as well, for becoming a YouTube member. Thank you. And here we have our first super chat. IP, one of our best apologists. Thank God for him. He has helped me tremendously with my faith. Highly recommend him. Very much appreciated. I do. That does mean a lot to me when people tell me that. I very much appreciated hearing that. So here we have another super chat. Didn't Paulogia postulate some anonymous 2nd century gospel writer? I don't think the apologists are the ones making the excuses for gospel authorship. What do you have to say about that, Stephen?
Well, that's how I took the original video. That's exactly how I took the original video. We responded to the original video because there were dogmatic statements made. We went in, and I don't remember how long that video was we did in response. 2 hours, maybe more.
Over. It was over.
Over 2 hours. And we went through very specific line items, and a group of us actually did it. And it feels like now, after watching the response, some of the hard blow was withdrawn. And there was actually some conceding. And again, I will get confirmation for everybody by Monday, this time next week. But I feel like he was willing to concede. So to answer the question, I think that was true of the first video. I didn't get that impression in the second video, but I could be wrong.
Oh, no, I kind of got the idea. And I get what this commenter is saying here about making excuses, which we'll get into in the video. And I'll bring this point back up. Maybe I'll put the super chat just back up on later on there. But yeah, you got to be careful with just saying all your opponent's arguments or excuses. But let's get into that real quick. The Gospel Truth is a great channel I've been on. He does a lot of debates. Everyone go subscribe. Showing some love to my IP and Boyce. Great job, fellas. Thank you. Thank you, Marlon. Much appreciated. All right, with that, you ready to get into the video?
Let's go.
All right, I'm going to put this up here. Now, again, we're not going to play every aspect. Some of the arguments that, like David Polliman or Eric Manning presenting, I'm not big on those myself personally. Not big issues to really die on. We're going to try to get to the meat here and the main points Paul wants to hit. Sorry if we missed something that was important, but here's one of his earliest points here, and we will start here.
Lots of affirmation for being well put together, fair, and true. So the criticisms won't be about my information being false. In their words, it was missing context, and they have explanations. So given that, before we begin, I want to share an insight from a recent Mr. Deity video.
This has to become the official emoji of Paulogia. It's like the emoji creators looked at a bunch of Paulogia's videos and thumbnails and made this emoji based on the face you can see him frequently making throughout.
No, not that.
All of us together have to stop using the term apologist and start calling these people what they are. Excusagists. That's all they really do. Make excuses for why this scripture doesn't say what it says, or why an all-powerful God can't do, well, anything anymore. And they're not even good at it. So maybe bad excusagist? No, that's too long. Let's just imbue the term excusagist with negative connotations.
That's what both of these streams felt like to me. My video made correct observations, and panelists replied by making excuses for why the data for traditional authorship isn't better. Here.
All right, Stephen. Apparently, I have been debating and arguing wrong for years. I didn't realize I could just call any objection or an answer to an objection an excuse. The next time I'm debating with a materialist or physicalist and I bring up the fact that, or they bring up the idea that, the brain creates consciousness, and I bring up all these problems with it, and then they try to offer explanations for how the brain could create consciousness, I don't have to engage with their arguments. I realize now I can just say they're making excuses.
Yeah.
If I offer arguments for God's existence and then the atheist tries to offer objections, I will just call those excuses, because that's apparently all you have to do now.
See, to me, it's not an excuse to actually press into claim and then actually say, no, you're actually not representing these arguments properly, or you misspoke. And again, it was a long video that we did in our response. We actually took our time. We didn't step back and start apologizing for things or saying, oh, let me explain this controversy. We actually took the main arguments that he was making and said that he didn't actually represent a church father correctly, or the data was not fully accurate. And we actually pressed in and challenged. I don't see how a challenge is an excuse. He clearly took the challenge, because in the second video, he answered our objections to his claims. I don't see how it was necessary to default that to, now you're just making, then why are you answering our objections? If they're just excuses, why are you answering them? You spend another response video answering objections, not excuses. Because if they were excuses, you would just let them go, right? I don't see that. It's us pressing into the matter and actually answering his claim by saying, you have wrongly applied this or read this or misused this information, and we feel like it needs to be clarified for everybody that this is not the full story. That's not an excuse. That's an objection or pressing into somebody to challenge them to answer you. And I feel like our challenge was answered. Wasn't that the whole point of the second video?
Look, it's not excuses to deal with the fact that certain worldviews have objections raised against it. That's every worldview. Every worldview has objections against it. Look, if we're serious about just calling our opponent's arguments excuses, this just opens a can of worms. Young Earth creationists who are anti-evolution, you've now just got the perfect argument. If you can just label everything you don't like an excuse, that because I would argue there's a lot of evidence for evolution, but it's not complete. There are some transitional fossils that we don't have. There are some aspects of the theory of evolution we cannot fully explain how certain traits came about. So an anti-evolutionist could just bring up those gaps and go, look, there are gaps here. And then if someone like Paulogia tries to offer an explanation for how that trait could have came about from an environment or from external, the young Earth creationists can just call that an excuse, apparently, because they don't have any evidence, but they're offering a plausible explanation to fill in that gap until more data is available. If we're just going to call things excuses, that's opening a can of worms here. Or we could be adults and not act like we're on the schoolyard playground and not just label everything we don't like an excuse and start engaging with the arguments. Because if we're going to do that, I'm just going to start using that tactic on anyone who tries it on me. You just can't call something an excuse and label something an excuse and think that's a good enough argument, and then also engage with their argument, because as you said, Stephen, that's not treating it as an excuse. That's treating it as a coherent objection that's been raised.
Correct.
Yeah. So
I mean, we could say that was whiny. I mean, we could say that was a whiny response, but I mean, what good is that? We could sit here and circular this thing all day. Let's just face the objections and the arguments, and let's actually talk about them, which, again, he was willing to talk to those one-on-one with me. So we'll see how that goes. But I love the idea of actually engaging arguments. I don't find it, and I don't know about you, I don't find this to be hard or difficult to sit here and respond back and forth. I enjoy it. I'm sure they have a level of enjoyment with it. We're actually putting everything on the table here. We're putting all the arguments out there on both sides so that people can have a clear, distinct reason for what we believe and why we believe it. I think it brings greater clarity to the argument. And I think that actually, as a result, we even pushed him to think differently about the argument. I believe that. I really do I really believe that we were able to make him think differently about this. And that's why he did another response video the way he did.
Yeah. And again, I don't think it's fair to label that excuses, because again, any anti-evolutionist can just label any explanation a scientist comes up with for holes in the evolutionary tree of life by just calling them excuses. And I don't think that would be fair for the anti-evolutionist to do. I think scientists coming up with coherent explanations for how certain traits could have evolved is how people work together and build coherent theories, because there's always going to be missing evidence and we always have to make inferences. We're not going to have complete certainty on things. And as this earlier super chat said, didn't Paulogia postulate some anonymous 2nd century gospel writer? I don't think the apologists are the ones making excuses for gospel authorship. And yeah, I mean, if we're just going to, they're positing for their theory that what they were originally doing, this idea that the gospels were originally anonymous and they only had authorship added in the 2nd century. There's no textual data that says that's what happens. They have to posit another assumption to explain for when the titles were added. Couldn't we just call that an excuse too if we're going to play the same game? It's a double-edged sword. You can't be doing that and expect it not to be thrown back in your face when you try it.
Agreed. And I don't think it's worth our time to even engage that type of terminology with each other. It's like, let's just talk about the data. You made a claim about this person, or you quoted this person as saying this. Let's actually talk about why. It's not making an excuse to say, hey, you didn't read somebody in their context, or you missed the whole history behind what led to that comment in history. And that you can have a person attached to a document and there's more to the story than just somebody's name slapped on the top of a manuscript. There may be a history behind that has been pieced together through other claims of antiquity that help us see a brighter, better picture of what's going on there. That's not an excuse. That's doing research. That's actually giving all the data, and it's being honest and saying, where we can't be dogmatic, we're not dogmatic, but we have enough accumulative evidence to make an argument here for eyewitness base. Because isn't that the point of our whole thing? Tell me if I'm wrong, because I've been on so many shows, and so have you. So did we actually say that we hold to the traditional authorship so dogmatically that it could be Matthew and Matthew alone? It could be Luke and Luke alone, John and John alone. I'm pretty sure from day one, we were posing the idea that there were multiple people, and our arguments were the gospels are eyewitness based, not so much strictly held to. Did we not make that clear? Again, I say it so much, maybe I didn't say it that one time we were streaming. My arguments for the gospels is they are eyewitness based. That's not limited to 4 guys at all.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And I've said before in videos that I take Paul's letters. I don't think Paul is the only author there. I think it's very clear these were always group documents in the ancient world. There are scribes there. There's going to be other people contributing that are working with Paul. And of course, I would say the same thing for the Gospels. I mean, just looking at the Muratorian fragment, which mentions Andrew with John, there were other brothers there.
Yep.
So when you see the passages in John saying that like this came from the beloved disciple and we know his testimony is true, that would be expected given the context you see in the Muratorian fragment that there's these other people with John as he is delivering this and they're helping him compose it, put structure to it. That's just how documents were composed in the ancient world.
And we're trying to take the internal evidence and the external evidence and match them up. The Muratorian fragment says Andrew was in this praying and fasting for 3 days. What do we see in the beginning of John? Who's the first person on the scene we see with John the Baptist? It's Andrew. So it's like, okay, so we have an external claim, we have an internal claim, and they match each other. That's not excuses. That's actually doing the research of seeing, is there a compatibility with the intrinsic reliability of this text and the external historical attestation about the text? Do they work together or are they contradicting each other? We see unity. That's not making excuses.
Yeah. Thank you for the super chat. He is risen. Christ is Lord. Yep. Right now on Twitter, I think some neo-Nazis, from what I've seen, are trying to hijack the phrase "Christ is King," which is
did you see that? It's all over the internet right now. It's a good grief. What's going on?
It's one of the stupidest things I think I've ever seen because, okay, yeah, a Jew is king. I completely agree with you there. Absolutely. So keep saying it. It just makes you guys look ridiculous. So appreciate it. This live refers to the gospel authorship. Yes, Raphael, we're talking about traditional authorship of the gospels again. And Stephen and I are working on some scripts for some videos this summer arguing for traditional authorship from external and internal evidence. I'm going to start on the script on Luke soon, and then I'll send it over to Stephen to fix up all my mistakes in that. So yeah, that's what we're talking about today. All right, let me put the video back up here, and we will go on to the next segment. I wanted to quickly look at this, I believe, from what my notes have.
I presented, though some of the time, the panel instead simply seemed to misunderstand the point. For example, my video points out that even if one grants that the third gospel was written by a traveling companion of Paul, there's no reason to expect that traveling companion would necessarily need to be someone mentioned elsewhere in the Bible. It could just as easily be a companion not mentioned in other books of the Bible.
Sure.
It is important.
That's excusogenics. That sounds like an excuse to me, Stephen. What do you mean? What do you mean it could be? Sure, it could be, but that just sounds like an excuse, Paul. Come on.
But we wouldn't argue with this premise. But we wouldn't even argue with this premise. Is it possible? Sure. It didn't have to be somebody listed to be that person. But what are we looking at? We're looking at a gospel that has an innumerable amount of medical terminology that Matthew and John and Mark and even Paul himself does not use. And we're finding a collective amount of usage of the early Greek physicians, even into the parables that Jesus uses, terminology about how he's healing people. And so we go, okay, the opening phrase of Luke is straight from Hippocrates' healing manual with the change of the last few words. It's the same wording. And he uses the same phraseology in multiple places that you find in Hippocrates, Galen, and others. And so we go, okay, this guy's trained in medicine. And then we go to the historical claims. The historical claims have that Paul was with Luke and traveled with him in all of these different regions, and that Luke, in his time with Paul, compiled a gospel from multiple eyewitnesses and used it for Paul's ministry and teaching. And we're just going, hey, the only physician that Paul ever claimed to have with him was Luke, the beloved physician. So yes, could it be? Does it have to be somebody listed? No, we would say Luke is scarcely mentioned and that he's not even a prominent figure. And the only reason he is prominent is because there's a gospel attributed to him. He's no more significant than Zenas the lawyer or somebody else that traveled with Paul. But we're looking at it saying, okay, there's somebody with medical knowledge who traveled with Paul that is being attested to by all of these fathers that it was Luke the physician. Nobody else says another name. There's not a second name. There's not even a scarce outside reputation that somebody else did this gospel with Paul. It's Luke by everybody. And Paul says that there was a beloved physician with him named Luke. And so again, we're taking the external evidence. We're looking at the intrinsic evidence. We're looking at the internal evidence. We're saying, hey, this guy knew medicine. This guy was a clear taught by the physicians of the Greeks. And it just harmonizes with what history is telling us. So, I agree with Paulogia here that we don't have to have. Paul is right.
Did you say Paulogia?
Yeah, I'm going to change the pronunciation because everybody else is. Everybody has their own pronunciation. So when we look at the opening line and he uses epikoreison, for example, in Greek, that term is not used anywhere else in the New Testament in the opening. Where do we find that? Oh, that exact line is used in Hippocrates' opening manual, The Healing Arts. Whoever wrote Luke knew medical language. Paul had a doctor with him. That doctor that was with him just so happens to be the claim of every church father was the one who penned the Gospel of Luke. So therefore, we just match terms and we match evidence and we say, this makes sense. It harmonizes. So no, it doesn't have to be somebody named, but it makes sense with somebody that was named.
Well, just to add to that, you did a live on your channel like maybe a week and a half ago on the whole two donkey issue on your Facts podcast. Yeah. And in the chat, you were getting hammered by Kip Davis. But Kip Davis said something that I completely agree with. He said, I wish I would have screenshot it, but he said something like, I'm not interested in what is possible. I'm interested in what is most probable. And I thought of that watching Paulogia's video. Yes, you can throw out all these possibilities.
Sure.
But what is most probable at the end of the day when we compile the internal and external evidence for Luke? It goes back to Luke, the companion of Paul, who talked with eyewitnesses while he was in Judea and in other areas of the Greco-Roman world. So, yeah, it's possible. But as Stephen pointed out, what's more probable? Well, Luke is going to be the most probable given the external and internal evidence. All right, let me pull this back up here. All right, next, we're going to get into some of the more important stuff we want to address, like more of my big notes are here. So I'm going to start playing this. Let me know if you want to stop at any point, Stephen.
Thin. The most obvious conclusion is that the names didn't exist yet. Now, if the traditional authorship gained acceptance between 120 and 180 AD,
it's not just individuals at certain times had an opinion. It's who these individuals were. Most of them are succession line bishops who are under the churches of the apostles. And they have the tradition of the apostles, both written and oral, being passed on and retaught through the bishops over and over again. So I think when we start trying to go, well, what about this gap period over here? What about it? Because if we can trace the succession lines, the gaps really don't matter. It's because of who they are, who they knew, who trained them, and what documents, what traditions were passed to them from the apostles. And Irenaeus is only one remove from the apostle John. He's not that far off. Clement of Alexandria being in tradition of Mark himself, because Mark is the one that went down into Alexandria and started these churches. These people knew. Polycarp knew the apostles, or particularly at least John. When you're talking about Ignatius, you're talking about Polycarp, you're talking about Papias. You're talking about people that knew the apostles, and not just knew them, even if you want to argue they didn't.
yes, I want to argue that they didn't. Did Polycarp, a Christian bishop in 2nd century Turkey, meet John the Apostle? Polycarp himself never made such a claim in his own writings. The earliest source mentioning a connection, Irenaeus in the 180s AD, only says that Polycarp was appointed bishop by unnamed apostles in Asia, and that unnamed sources told Irenaeus that Polycarp had met John. Irenaeus never states that he heard Polycarp himself make these claims. Polycarp's own letter to the Philippians.
So,
Yeah.
Again, call it excuses, but this is actually just wrong. It's incorrect. Irenaeus actually tells multiple stories in connection to Polycarp and his connection to John. Irenaeus, specifically, when we look at his connection by Polycarp, he tells stories, and you actually probably have you could probably pull it up for your audience if you want. We have a quote from him where he and another individual that he was being trained with at the time, he tries to bring back to remembrance to this man.
Are you talking about Against Heresies 3:3?
Yeah, if you want to bring that one up too. I mean, we can. Yeah. There's more than one. I mean, this is I don't know if you can pull it up, but
I got
Against Heresies
right here. Yeah, section 4, I believe. Yeah.
When you get into this, okay, specifically this story. So when Irenaeus was recounting what he had learned from Polycarp, when Polycarp was with John in Ephesus, they were going to a public bathing. Picture it as a public sauna. And Cerinthus, the heretic, who actually started the early stage of Gnosticism, which was called Cerinthianism, was actually in the building bathing. And apparently Polycarp, while he and John were going into this public bathing, they run into Cerinthus, and John makes this proclamation that let's get out of this place before the walls collapse on it, because the heretic is in there. And, and there's this remembrance of Irenaeus hearing this story from Polycarp about John. So he was actually with him. We also have statements beyond that. I mean, even Eusebius, we got to keep in mind, he said that Polycarp doesn't make any claim to that. The only letter, folks, that we have of Polycarp is one single letter to the Philippians. And it took 2 separate languages of manuscripts to reconstruct a single letter. And we're not even positive that we have the whole letter, or if it was 2 letters put into one. I do think it's been reconstructed. When you look at Polycarp's letter, in fact, when I had to do my research on it, it starts in Greek, and then it cuts off from what we have fragmented of it. And then there's a Latin section that actually comes in right into the middle of the letter of the Philippians. And then you finish it back with Greek and Latin toward the end. It took a Greek manuscript and a Latin manuscript to reconstruct a single letter of Polycarp to the Philippians. That is the only letter we have. We have letters of Ignatius to Polycarp, who's responding to Polycarp, but we do not have any response letters from him back to Ignatius. We have one single letter. And in that letter, all he does is claim and instruct the church and remind them of what they've been taught. So no, he didn't sit there and say, I knew this guy, I knew this guy, I knew this guy. He's writing a personalized letter, not about his companionship with the apostles. He's writing a letter to encourage the Philippian church. That's what he's doing. So no, we don't have any claims, but we have historical claims about him. Beyond Irenaeus, even Eusebius spends his time talking about how Polycarp made a claim that he celebrated Easter on the 14th day of Nisan with John the Apostle. So, and remember, Eusebius has archive records that we don't have anymore. He's a court historian. He's looking at data. And what does he find? He finds where Polycarp made a claim. Again, we don't have all of what Polycarp had. Eusebius had a lot more than what we have. And his claim is that John and he celebrated an Easter together on the 14th of Nisan. And so Irenaeus says that he was told this recollection. Even in the lost writings of Irenaeus, we have a statement where, which I was mentioning earlier, a younger person and he were raised together and trained together.
Let me read this out for them. So he says, for a while I was yet a boy, I saw in Lower Asia with Polycarp distinguishing yourself in the royal court and endeavoring to gain his appropriation. For I have a more vivid recollection of what occurred at the time than of recent events, in so much as the experience of childhood keeping pace with the growth of the soul, becoming incorporated with it, so that I can even describe the place where the blessed Polycarp used to sit and discourse, his going out to and his coming in, his general mode of life and personal appearances, together with the discourse when he delivered to the people, also how he would speak with familiar intercourse with John and with the rest of those who had seen the Lord, and how they would call their words to remembrance. So you're right. He goes into more detail in other places, explaining how he knew where Polycarp taught. He heard him teach. All these other aspects. It's not just like, yeah, I met him once.
Yeah, and he even went so far as to say, as young as we were at that time, I can still vividly see the place where he taught in my mind, and I could go back to that place and point at it and say, this is the spot he taught us. I mean, he had a recollection of his time existing under the teaching of Polycarp, and he uses this to rebuke somebody who's becoming wayward in his thinking and saying, hey, man, I remember what we were taught. And apparently I remember better than you did. I remember the exact place he was. And, we use that terminology too, Michael. I mean, we say things like, I can take you to the exact spot I was when I said this to you. I remember it in my mind very vividly. And we make a comment because we're confident about what we heard and where we were when we heard it. And so he is reminding a friend who's become wayward about their time with Polycarp and the teaching they were given on that subject. That doesn't sound like somebody who never made any claim and that he got it from just miscellaneous people. Or I think his statement was that unknown sources provided this information. No, he's going off his memory in this section. That's not unknown sources. And again, he's not independent in making this claim. I mean, Eusebius had record of Polycarp. And again, we don't have everything that Polycarp wrote. We have letters written to him, one letter reconstructed from him. And no, he doesn't sit there and give his whole entire, this is who I knew arguments. The only one he mentioned specifically in that letter is that they should appeal to the letter of Paul. No, he doesn't mention John, but why would it be significant that he mentions Paul, not John? Because in that statement he made to them in the letter of the Philippians is that they should go back and read the letter Paul wrote to them, for in doing so, their faith would be increased. So it makes sense for the occasion, writing to one of Paul's churches, that they be reminded of the letter Paul wrote to them, and that they would read that letter and their faith would be increased by reading it. So at that moment, it makes no sense to just throw maybe a John in there, because John didn't start the church of Philippi. Paul did. So it makes sense that he would quote Paul and mention Paul.
Yeah, I agree with that right there. All right, I'm going to play a little more of the video here, because we need to get to some of those questions there at the end that he's got for you. So let me just put this up and we'll play a little bit more.
Mentions the apostles only as historical figures whose teachings were passed down. not as people he knew personally. As time passed, later sources like Tertullian and Eusebius embellished the story, contradicting the earlier accounts. Tertullian in the early 200s AD claimed that Polycarp was appointed bishop by John the Apostle himself, even though this would be chronologically impossible given John's advanced age. Eusebius.
Also,
All right.
so let's pause on that. When
I can read
according
the
to
quote here from,
Go
let
for
me
it,
just
go
read the
for it.
quote here. I wrote it down here. Tertullian says, for this is the manner in which the apostolic churches transmit their registers, as the church of Smyrna, which records that Polycarp was placed therein by John, as also the church of Rome, which makes Clement to have been ordained in the like manner by Peter. And that's in Prescription Against Heresies, chapter
Yes.
32, section 2.
So, and what he's looking at is registration. What is Tertullian? Remember, Tertullian is a lawyer. Okay. His goal was defending Christianity in a legal sense. And the only way you can make a legal case is documentation. What is he looking at? He's looking at the registration of the bishops. That's what he's talking about. And he's saying that he still can see the registration of those bishops all the way to his time. He mentions Clement in Rome. He mentions John bringing down Polycarp in succession. They have registration of that. This is a record-keeping situation. He's not just making this up. And I also don't see where he's contradicting anything here based on timeline. If Polycarp said in the martyrdom of Polycarp that's said about him in his proclamation at his execution, he was mentioning that these 86 years. So he obviously was an older man at 86 years old. John lived to be a very old man. From the record we have of Jerome and others, we can construct the idea that he died around 100 to 102, I think closer to 101 from the time of Trajan. And so if John lived to be 100 AD and Polycarp's martyrdom, which I think is earlier, they would say, Michael, it's in the mid 2nd century, about 150. Even if that's the case, if Polycarp was a young man with John, he could have been a young man with old man John in the 90s just fine, because if he was 86 years old in 150 AD, do the math back into the 1st century. He was alive in the 1st century at the time that John was at his height of teaching and ministry. It absolutely mathematically fits. Am I missing something here? How does that not fit? If Polycarp was 86 in the middle of the 2nd century, how does he not work his time back to John?
Now, maybe Paul's got a better case here, but I think what I saw is that what is said is Polycarp was born around 69 AD. That would place him in his early 30s around the time that John had died. And this is not too different than like Paul sending Timothy to Ephesus, for example. I mean, Timothy was younger. And he's sent there to, be head of the church there. You could have the same thing with John and Polycarp. So again, not a big issue. I'd like to see more about what Paul has to say on that, but I don't know. I don't get the argument here. I don't think it's a really good one there. So, all right, let's move along.
In the early 300s AD, went even further, quoting a likely forged letter in which Irenaeus allegedly describes hearing Polycarp talk about his direct interactions with John and other disciples, even though Irenaeus's authentic writings make no such claims. This progression suggests a legend growing over time rather than an authentic historical record. The evidence indicates that Polycarp, like his contemporary Papias, probably never met the apostles directly, contrary to later legends. As for this tenuous idea that
it's not later legends.
Quite a leap.
Papias said that of himself. That's not a legend about him. He said that he knew the eyewitnesses, that he had spent time with them. I mean, he mentions 2 of them by name, Aristion and John the Elder. That's not a legend about him. That's what he's saying about himself. And that if he had any record that came into him that was contradictory of that which he had learned from, and he lists the apostles there. I mean, we have claim from even the Anti-Marcionite Prologue, for example, that he was the scribe of the Gospel of John. Whether that's true or not is irrelevant. The point is there's a lot of attachment in history to him and John. This isn't just legend in that sense. What makes it legend? These are claims of history. That's not legend. He's making it about himself. And by the way, Eusebius didn't argue with it. Eusebius didn't say, he made that up. When he thought Papias was being crazy, he would say so.
Right. And that's an important point too. Eusebius, there seems to be an implication that Eusebius is just like not doing research. He's just making excuses or coming up with legends. And no, he had access to a lot more documents. I mean, he had access to the writings of Papias. He had a lot more documentation he could sift through that we just don't have. But this is the case with a lot of ancient history. Herodotus had access to a lot more documentation that we don't have. I mean, we've lost places like the Library of Alexandria, for example, the documentation that was there. We've lost a lot of the documentation in Rome that someone like Tacitus would have used. We don't just say Tacitus is making excuses or making up legends because we can't check his sources. We say, well, generally, we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt. We're going to apply the principle of charity. I don't see why we wouldn't do the same thing with Eusebius. If you've got a good reason to doubt what they're saying, present it. But I don't see any reason here to think he's actually contradicting Irenaeus or even Tertullian for that matter.
They're actually saying the same thing. They're actually saying the same thing on succession. Their succession lines are identical. So I don't know where the contradictions would be. They're saying the same thing in succession lines because that was Tertullian's point. Eusebius has the same list. Irenaeus has the same list. They're all saying the same exact thing. And keep in mind for your audience here that Eusebius is a court historian for Constantine. That everything he writes is under the eyes of those that are going to read it. He's a court historian. He's not some random guy. We're not saying he's infallible or anything. I mean, he made mistakes like anybody else, but he's looking at things earlier than we are looking at.
All right, let's play a little bit more of this section here. Then I'll do some super chats and we'll move on to the next section.
That Clement of Alexandria is an authoritative voice on this because Mark started the church in Alexandria. Well, the earliest evidence for Mark starting the church is acclaimed by Eusebius in the 4th century and later by Jerome in the 5th century. More importantly, Clement himself makes no such claim to have known Mark or any disciple personally, or even to be in any kind of Mark tradition. Again,
we never said
this
he
appears
did.
to be later.
So I never said he knew Mark. I said he was in Mark's churches, and that is the Church of Alexandria. And the Church of Alexandria is easily traced. You can, to this day, folks, you can pull up the Coptic Church and look at the succession line of bishops by name and by age, by date and their age, and how many bishops have succeeded from John Mark to today. And there is a split in there where the Coptic split off into 2 branches, but you can find it. And it is an easy thing to trace because we have so much that happened in Alexandria after you look at the school of Alexandria, which is where Clement was a part of, he and Origen. They were part of the school of Alexandria. Athanasius was trained in that school. Others like Gregory of Nazianzus were told to have been trained there. And we know that that is a succession. We actually have more stories than just like, oh, somebody made this claim. Again, you have succession lists. That's what they're looking at. We have stories where Peter, not Peter the apostle, Peter, the bishop of Alexandria, right before his execution, would go up to the actual tomb of Mark and actually say a few words in his departure. We have statements, for example, like Gregory of Nazianzus says this specifically when he's talking about Athanasius and his succession in the line of Mark. Gregory of Nazianzus says, but in an apostolic and spiritual manner, he is laid up to the throne of St. Mark to succeed him in piety, no less than office. And the latter indeed a great distance from him, in the former, which the genuine right of succession following him closely. Meaning, when he looked at the time when Athanasius died, he examined his life and said he was worthy of the succession line he was in to St. Mark. We have multiple attestation, including modern list of succession from John Mark. Now, I never said that Clement of Alexandria knew the apostles. He was too far removed to know the apostles.
Right.
What I'm saying is he has records. He's not just pulling this stuff out. He actually has records of what happened in the church. And they have a whole school in Alexandria that's studying manuscripts, the historical nature of things that have taken place before them, from philosophy into their theology, Jesus's ministry. He's investigating multiple things. He knows exactly who's in charge. In fact, when Clement of Alexandria was put in place as a leader in the school of Alexandria, especially Origen had to go to Caesarea because he got a little bit crazy in his theology. After Origen had to leave, and then you have guys like Clement who come in and actually start leading this school. Who do you think appointed him? It was the bishop of Alexandria who put him in that position. He didn't just get voted in by a crowd. So he knew the succession line of bishops. He doesn't have to say it. Some things are assumed knowledge. When somebody says, I am a citizen of the United States, I don't have to necessarily include the fact of who the modern president or the last president was in order to prove my point. I am a United States citizen, and it's assumed you know who the leader is of your country. If you are in the church of Alexandria and you're in the school of Alexandria, it's assumed you know who the succession leaders of that school and that church are. It doesn't have to be stated for it to be true.
Yeah, and I think we need to remember, again, we need to apply the principle of charity here. This is how ancient history works. We just cannot be hyper skeptical of everything Tacitus wrote if we can't verify his sources on things. If we did that, we'd immediately go back into the Dark Ages in terms of our knowledge of the past, because a lot of it just sort of works on the fragments we have remaining from the ancient world, because a lot has been lost due to time, invasions, wars, these kinds of things. So we apply the principle of charity for these things. And when it comes to the gospel authorship,
and we corroborate the evidence. And when he mentions these three people, he thinks they're just making it up flimsy information. They're actually corroborating with each other, and they're actually evidence that they actually have the same information.
Yeah. Thank you for the super chat, Yeshua the King. How would John know that Jesus and Pilate said when he took Jesus to the back room to question him, or did he only take him back in the movie?
Huh? Oh, movie. What movie is he talking? I don't even know.
I'm getting you talking about the Passion of Christ or any one of those things.
Okay.
Where sometimes you'll see in the movies like Pilate and Jesus are talking in an empty room. And if you read the book, Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes or Misreading Scripture with Individualistic Eyes, that didn't happen. People were never alone. Like there were always other people. There were servants nearby. There were other people listening in who may have come over with the priest, these kinds of things. No one was really alone in the ancient world. This is why I think Judas had to point out Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. We think Jesus was alone praying in the garden, but this is Passover, and you're in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night of Passover. It would have been flooded with pilgrims and people enjoying the festival. There would have been a lot of people there. They probably had to point out who Jesus was because there were so many people to pick from. So I think there would probably be numerous other people there.
And it could, in another opportunity. So you got that. You've got that Pilate. There's very early traditions, especially in the Ethiopic churches, that Pilate converted to Christianity. And it is worth noting that John is very soft on Pilate and tries to actually defend Pilate a little bit. When Pilate was asking Jesus questions, it said that he went all that the more to actually get him out of this situation after he found out when Jesus said, you only have the authority that my Father gives you. He tried to get himself out of even more. It's John that tells us that his wife actually had this dream and comes in and says, have nothing to do with this individual. So, I mean, when you look at it, it's possible that maybe Pilate himself later as becoming a Christian gave this information. We don't know. Also, by the way, I think that's the least likely. I'm just saying it's possible. The more probable is Jesus spent multiple amount of time with his disciples after the resurrection and instructing them and giving them information. I mean, John is seen leaning up on Jesus's breast post-resurrection, eating fish on the side of the seashore. They had multiple conversations, and he appeared to them many, many times after his resurrection. It could have just been simply what Jesus told them. I mean, there's a lot of opportunities, including yours, to explain how this is possible.
Yeah. Thank you for the super chat. We'll be posting my first video soon on Lemon Apologetics, my sermon on Joseph and suffering. Thank you for all the inspiration, IP. Thank you for that, Charles. Good luck on your channel. Keep posting and keep growing. Thank you for the super chat. Christ is Lord, Christ is King, Christ is God. Simple as that. Anyway, keep up the good work, IP. Much appreciated. Thank you for that. All right, let me put the video back up here, and we will play a little bit more here. let me see where we're at. I think it's time to move to the next section, which is one part I wanted to. I think it was like the only part I really wanted to address in detail, which is I think the 25-minute mark. So I'm going to move it up here a little bit for anybody who's watching, because I think we've kind of hit the main points here. Again, we can't get to everything because we'll be here for 5 hours, and I can't look at Stephen that long. I'll start to.
No, and let me clarify.
terrified.
It's not John that mentioned Pilate's wife. It was Matthew, but it's John talking. I think I saw somebody. It's John speaking to Jesus, trying to get him out of it. In addition, we learn that his wife is like in his ear, like, get away from this innocent man. So that just to clarify, so don't get pinned on that later either.
Yeah, I know. We got to clarify that kind of stuff. Yeah, no worries. And, probably we'll misspeak one time here or there. We'll be fine with that.
Month. I'd greatly appreciate that. Anyhow, the panel thinks that this Theophilus connection is a defeater.
You're right. So we're not talking about the prologue of Luke's gospel where he says he's writing to Theophilus. And here's something that I brought up. He is, because we know that when Theophilus got this, he would have known who this came from. It's very unlikely that someone just stuck this on his door. Here, Theophilus. There's clearly a relationship between.
Camille's point was that just because Theophilus knew whom he commissioned, that doesn't mean that knowledge was necessarily widely passed on as the books were copied and distributed.
I get that Camille is saying that they were not originally anonymous. People knew who wrote them. So clearly Theophilus knows Camille. So Theophilus got it from somebody named Joe, for all we know. He somehow forgets, or he dies with that knowledge. Someone then takes the gospel, and then 100 years later, some guy's like, I'm going to slap the name Luke on this. It's a much simpler explanation to say the reason we have unanimous attestation is because it went back to those 4 authors, versus the idea they were originally not anonymous. Then the traditional authors were forgotten, and someone made it up, and he had used his iron grip on the church to force. It's a convoluted explanation over the much simpler one. So that Theophilus would have just someone lost the name, or he died with the name. It's just the explanation to deny traditional authorship, as you see, gets convoluted. We're building assumptions on assumptions that cannot be justified. It's insane.
Maybe, but here's the thing.
All right, real quick, just to clarify, my basic point is this. It's about parsimony. What's going to be the simplest explanation that explains all the data? So is it the idea, the reason we have unanimous attestation for the gospel authorships from various church fathers, unlike something like the book of Hebrews where they're wrestling and not sure and they propose different authors? Why do we have unanimous attestation for the gospel authors? And we also know that Luke wrote to the author wrote to Theophilus, and it would not have been anonymous. Theophilus would have known who this came from.
No.
What is more parsimonious? More parsimonious is that Theophilus just passed on the name, and that's why we have unanimous attestation as the church grows and spreads out, versus the idea that someone wrote to Theophilus, he got the name, was forgotten. Then that gospel was spread around. Later in the church, some unknown, unwritten about author or church authority had an iron grip on all the churches spread out around the Roman world and outside of it. And he said, I'm going to ascribe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then everyone clapped. Everyone went along with it. It was a joyous, wonderful party. That's a convoluted, long explanation that does not reach parsimony. At the end of the day, my argument is pretty simple. Traditional authorship is far more likely given this data. Let's hear what Paul has to say on that now.
Thing that the videos were pointing out. There's no actual evidence that Theophilus actually attributed these works to Luke. Mike may find that position more parsimonious, but that doesn't make it any less an assumption. There's no evidence whatsoever for either position. There's not even unanimity that Theophilus was a person. Many scholars and commentators, including Mike's oft-quoted Richard Bauckham in The Gospel for All Christians, have proposed or explored the view that Theophilus represents a literary device by the author, rather than representing a specific flesh and blood individual. We're left with the fact that we have no surviving reference to Luke being the author until around 180 AD. This panel wants to posit it had to have been Luke from the beginning, and I'm positing that it could have been attached anytime before 180 AD. Absent any conclusive data either way, you're free to draw your own conclusions, but let's not pretend I'm the one making unjustified assumptions here.
What we don't have.
Okay. If you're not making unjustified assumptions, don't posit this idea that authorship for the Gospels was added in the 2nd century and they were originally just anonymous as they circulated. If you want to do that, fine. Sure, it's possible, but it's not the most probable. It's not the most parsimonious. It's not the simplest explanation. Again, we see this shift and what I thought Paul was arguing in his earlier videos, that the Gospels were originally anonymous, and then the traditional authorship names were added in the 2nd century. It seems now that Paul is arguing, well, I'm just not convinced of traditional authorship. I don't see enough evidence, and it could have possibly, maybe, been added at a later time. Sure, it's possible, but don't tell me you're offering a rival explanation to traditional authorship, which is the best explanation given the data. Yeah, we're not saying Theophilus, we have a record of Theophilus saying, Luke sent me this gospel. We're making an inference based on the available data. We've unanimous attestation this gospel came from Luke, from later church fathers. Unlike Hebrews, which they admit they don't know who wrote that and they debate about different authors. But for Luke, they all unanimously agree, spread across wide different geographical regions. And we know that Theophilus would have received a work from someone he knew. What's more likely given these two pieces of data? Well, it's far more likely that Theophilus got it from someone named Luke, and he passed on that tradition. And that's why we see various geographical regions around the Roman Empire saying it was Luke, because that's the source of the tradition. It's very early for it. It has to be very early for it to be that widespread across multiple regions and different church fathers. So if Paul's not convinced, fine. I don't care. Same thing I say in my debates with atheists on God's existence. But this is still the best explanation of the data at the end of the day. You don't have to be convinced, but don't tell me you have a better explanation or ours is not the best explanation, or you have a more parsimonious explanation, because that's not what we're arguing. We're arguing this is the best explanation, not that it's certain, the only explanation you can posit.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you want to add before we go on?
So this is an important point. What you're describing is multiple attestation. One of the things that we see in a lot of authorship, and you mentioned Hebrews, but we can go on and on and on for other early works that have 2 or 3 or 4 names given to a document. I'll give you an important one in an ecumenical sense. I mentioned this to you, and something I've been thinking about recently. I just did an episode on the Athanasian Creed. The Roman Catholicism almost adamantly defends it to be Athanasius. We have other names attached to it. We have names of Frenchmen. We've got names like, and in fact, Ambrose of Milan is thrown as a possible author for it as well. And then you look at it, it's used in ecumenical council. It's talked about, even the council, not an ecumenical, but another council, the Council of Toledo, is using it and applying it. Then you have Rome adopting it. So it's very, very clear it's a Western text. It's used in Anglicanism. It's used in Lutherans. It's used in Roman Catholicism as a creed, one of the main 3 creeds that is held to by a major church like Rome. But we don't know who actually wrote it. And we have multiple names that are attached to it. And it is still received by the church, by a major church like Rome, to be one of the main 3 creeds that is referenced and used on Trinitarian Sunday. And so what they do is they'll say it's Athanasian. A lot of us take the position that it's probably based on what Gregory of Nazianzus says about Athanasius, that he wrote a confession and a defense to the emperor. We would probably say something in that letter was distributed and somebody fell in love with the wording of Athanasius and compiled and edited a greater text. But we don't know because we have so many names attached to the potentiality of this. That's what it looks like to have a church counseled document that cannot be traced. It seems Athanasian, but there's skepticism to it because the earliest form of it is in Latin. Athanasius would have probably written in Greek. Some have said Augustine wrote it since it is Latin and it seems to be from. So see, what you do is you actually have different language You have a language problem. You have an internal problem of it being Athanasius. You have multiple attestation of it being different names from the West to North Africa being attached to it. And now you have a decision to make. And most people just say its statements are true and orthodox, so let's adopt it and put Athanasius's name on it because he's the champion of Trinitarianism. So that's what ends up happening When we look at the Gospels, we don't have that. We don't have a second name. We don't have a third name. We don't even have a language issue going from one to the other to make it match. With Luke, which is his example here, we have a guy, and even Kip Davis a long time ago said this to me, and then he actually put it in the chat. He said, let's grant Stephen that there is physician terms all in this, and whoever wrote this was very much trained in physician terms. Why does it have to be Luke? Okay, so if you're willing to at least acknowledge, and I'm sure your video that will come out with our data on Luke will be full of this, if there's physician terminology everywhere in Luke that can't be traced anywhere else in the New Testament, and somebody wants to go, okay, fine, there's a lot of physician terms here. What we're doing is we're actually trying to come up with the most reasonable explanation for this. Is it anywhere in history say a physician wrote this book? Everywhere says a physician wrote this book.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they're all saying it's Luke the physician. Does Paul ever claim to have a guy with him named Luke? Yes. Does he ever describe him as a physician? Yes. He describes him as a beloved physician. So what we're doing is we're matching the pieces and seeing them fit. We're not forcing puzzle pieces to work. They fit easily together when you look at the data on the inside of the text, physician terms everywhere. And then you have people saying, yeah, Luke the physician did it. Then you see that Paul claims to have a physician with him. We're just taking all the pieces and we're putting them together and saying, this is the picture in the puzzle pieces. Luke the physician wrote a gospel while with Paul and traveled with Paul. Paul used it. Paul practiced it. Paul quoted from it. And we see others that are giving reference to it into Theophilus. So even if Theophilus is not a real guy, he's a concept of the words, which some believe. That actually makes it far more widely distributed. And by the way, if a letter was personally written to Theophilus, we learn this from the Shepherd of Hermas and other documents. They would never just write one single letter, usually in a situation like this, especially a volume that size. They would have sent multiple originals. So Luke would have kept his own copy. He would have sent a copy to Theophilus, and anyone else that would have needed it would have had in them a copy of Luke. And I did an episode on this a long time ago, Michael, how the original autographs would have been distributed. And I talk about how that would have worked. And you see it in the New Testament. You see it in the Shepherd of Hermas and others. There were copies that were made and sent while original documents were held. And any time the original writer had that document, he could at any point make any edits he wanted and it still be an original. But they almost never just wrote something and sent it off and said, boy, I hope it makes it there. Think about how big this volume is. Think about how much time Luke put into this volume. What if that letter was sent, or let's say it wasn't Luke, just some random guy, put all this effort into this letter of a gospel and only made one copy, sent out on horseback and ship to get to Theophilus, and it was destroyed in shipwreck, or it was captured. Now you have nothing. These writers would have been meticulous to keep multiple copies of this. So it's not just dependent on Theophilus getting it out. Luke would have gotten it out himself in addition to Theophilus.
Yeah, I know Cicero talked about keeping records of all his own letters. And I think at one point, one of the stories about Alexander the Great, he gets so angry to scribes, he burns like the tent or something that contained all of this. And they go, what do? You just burned all your letters. So he has to write to people he sent letters to, asking him to send copies back of his own letters. Yeah. So they very much did keep copies of this kind of stuff. Nice. Thank you for the super chat. Hi from Brazil. Is Papias and Irenaeus isn't reliable? I'm guessing English isn't your first language if you're from Brazil. I guess you're asking, is Papias and Irenaeus reliable? And that's basically what we're arguing here. That not that they're perfect, but they have reliable traditions that corroborate each other, and then we can use that kind of stuff. Thank you, Joe. I very much enjoy reading St. Polycarp's Martyrdom. He's a great example of courage and faithfulness. He has been a prominent role model in developing my masculinity. Thanks for the great content. Much appreciated. Thank you. Hi, IP. Just wanted to say thank you for your ministry. Your videos helped me leave the Torah observant movement. I'm coming into the Catholic Church Saturday. That is beautiful and wonderful to hear. Thank God for that. I see a lot of anti-Trinitarianism in the Torah observant movement. So I'm very skeptical of that movement, and I like to see people out of it, given how much heresy is actually flowing through it.
So there you go. Read the
wonderful
Athanasian Creed. Read the Athanasian Creed, because your church you're going into Saturday holds it dearly.
Excellent. Yeah, always great to hear, and it's good to see you in the Catholic Church. All right, let me hit play here.
Don't have is the original autographs. We don't know what was written on the outside of the manuscript. We don't know what was written on the first page of manuscripts that were given to the church. We don't know what salutation was written in addition to the text itself, which form it was in. There's so many what ifs that none of us on any side of the argument are going to be able to make a definitive position on that alone. That's why I don't think we can make a singularity debate here. It has to be on what did the churches accept and what would they never have accepted? What would they have never accepted in a manuscript form? They're on high alert. We already know in the time of the apostles that they were being forged. Paul was concerned about this. Peter talks about corruptions to the word of God and to the works of Paul. We already see things happening to the text while the apostles were living. So then we got to ask ourselves, did they set in order protection where anonymous writings would never even be considered by the church to be accepted? If they weren't accepting writings right away with apostles' names on them, how much more skeptical should they have been with writings that don't have any name on them?
Should I accept this tale of ultra careful churches in a time when all the congregants were believers in miracles based solely on testimony and were demonstrably being fooled by forgeries? Did the first century church really care about these attributions? What say you, Stephen from later in the video?
What say you, Stephen? What say you, Stephen, present time?
Yeah. So it's interesting. We're talking in that point, if I remember correctly, about Tertullian's statement about Marcion's gospel that was trying to be passed in anonymously. And Tertullian mocks Marcion that he would ever try to slip in a document without a name on it, and that it would have never had been received. And so I like how that was completely skipped over in this discussion, that the point needs to be answered on their end. Tertullian is saying that Marcion mutilated the Gospel of Luke and tried to pass it through the churches without a name. The only record we have of an anonymous gospel is that one. And, may I add, they were able to trace it to its author. They all knew it was Marcion, not just in one location. Irenaeus writes against it over in modern day France. Tertullian is writing against it in North Africa. How is it that an anonymous gospel tried to slip into the churches and they still knew where to trace it? See, they're smarter. They're smarter than Paul is trying to give them credit for. Oh, what would a bunch of miracle believing Christians in the first century care about being careful?
And to be real quick, just to add, that sounds a lot like a fallacious argument. It sounds like he's just trying to poison the well or commit a genetic fallacy here. That's not a good argument if it sounds very much like a fallacy, and very well may just be a fallacy from Paul.
Yeah, okay. So they believe, I mean, my goodness, many of the historians of the Greeks and Romans believed in the Titans and the fights, and so we don't take any of their, where do we draw this line, right? Okay. I can't with that. But
well,
go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just add, and even when we start to study this, we don't think that these ancient Greeks were stupid when they were talking about Titans or myths of monsters. I did a whole video on this in September. We know they found bones of mastodons and mammoths, and then they posited giant beasts from this. Did they get everything right? Obviously not. But they weren't stupid. They knew there were giant creatures in the past, and so they posited stories about these giant creatures that they also got from other writings that were handed down from their ancestors and these kinds of things. So it's not like they were just being morons walking around. And why would we think that of them? Likewise with the early church and the early Christian fathers. They weren't idiots. They made very detailed, long, educated arguments in response to heretics and other groups, just to say, well, they were just miracle believers. Let's just dismiss. That's ridiculous. That's really modern bias.
It is. And again, he skipped over the point I made in 2 Peter, how Peter was already warning the churches that the scriptures were being twisted along with Paul's letters. So at that point, whether you believe Peter wrote it or not, because I know Paul doesn't, it's still an early document showing warning against Paul's letters being corrupt. Paul knew his letters were being corrupted. That's why he put his own signature on them. He warned about corruption and even said, if you get a letter from me or anybody else, from an angel from heaven that teaches you a different gospel, let him be anathema, because there were forgeries, there were corrections. And that's why he signed his own name and his own salutations, because there were corruptions to the letters. This isn't just some myth we just made up out of thin air. They were corrupting the text while the apostles were alive. Tertullian is pointing out an individual who took the Gospel of Luke, mutilated it, tried to pass it into the church anonymously, and everyone somehow, some way, figured out who it was that was doing it. They traced it to Marcion. Again, nowhere in that video did he answer that. He skipped that whole section and didn't answer how an anonymous document was passed through a church and how the churches saw anonymous documents. They rejected it. And part two, how did they know it went back to Marcion if it was anonymous? They figured it out. So how likely is it that 4 anonymous gospels, when others are trying to pass through, make it in, get some names on it, and they just go through anonymously and add the names later while that's not consistent? And then we also pose in that video that who in the world would put Luke and Mark's name on 2 of the 4 gospels when you're trying to pass it through after anonymity? Because Luke's insignificant. Again, if he wasn't even being subject to the Gospel of Luke, nobody would think of him as any importance. John Mark was seen as a coward through most of his ministry and not seen profitable until the end of Paul. Why would you throw their names on there? And the point I also made that was not mentioned is that in the Gnostic text, they sought to get credibility by putting eyewitnesses on the accounts. John, Peter, Philip, Thomas, and even women like Mary Magdalene. They sought to put significant characters on the documents, not Luke and Mark. There's no forgeries with Luke out there right now, by the way. There's possibly one weird one for Mark, but all of it's John and Paul and Peter and Thomas and Philip. That's who's on these documents, because that's trying to sell you on a product that these others were not. It went to Luke. So that's who it went to.
Yeah. So at this point, I'm just going to play it. You let me know when you want to stop and respond. I responded to the main point. If I was doing this by myself, I just would have played that one earlier section, him responding to me specifically, because that's the only thing I want to address. So when you're ready to hit stop again, just let me know and I will stop and you can knock it out of the park.
In the liturgical readings of the scripture, we see in the early church, most believers that sat in a church service did not have a copy of the Word of God. They're not looking at a written text. There's typically just a handful of written texts within a room of a church, and the president or the priest is up there reading the text for the liturgical reading. Most of the early church was working off memorization. To sit there and say, our gospel reading is this, and then it reads from Matthew. It's like, well, why did the priest say Matthew? They didn't care about whether it came from Matthew. They cared about, did it come from the church of Jerusalem or from the apostolic group there or from the eyewitnesses? That's all they needed. Whether or not Matthew was the penman or a partial authority or a partial eyewitness blended in with James and whoever else, that's irrelevant to the people that are just sitting in a congregation in service that day, who are hearing and trying to get news of Jesus that is in written form that most of them probably can't read or personally own a copy of. So they're going to sit there and they're going to listen to the oral reading of the Word of God, and they're going to try to memorize it as much as possible as the teachings of Jesus or as the teachings of the apostles. Their goal wasn't to sit here and just constantly have to put these names in it.
So which is it? Were the author names super duper important to the early congregations, or were they not important at all? I think you paint a compelling case for the names initially being not important at all.
So this is answering. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
It sounds like, no, I was just going to say, it sounds like you're being taken out of a little context there.
You think? To me, that's a bait and switch. That's a bait and switch move. So you're going from something I was making a point about, anonymity would never have passed because of this. And then we're taking an argument I made from liturgical readings. I don't think when we're talking about this, I think and again, I can't remember exactly, but if you go to a service, and our friend here that's just become Catholic, he'll learn this really quick. When you come to a service or an Anglican service like I do, when you read the gospel readings every Sunday, you read the gospel readings, and at the end of it, the reading is done. The priest gets up and says these very words, the gospel of the Lord. And we say, thanks be to God. He doesn't say the gospel of Matthew, even though he just read Matthew, or the gospel of John, if he just read John. My point in the second clip that he mentioned was that the churches were not concerned about the authorship because they already established its authenticity. They didn't have to. My point was, you don't have to say it over and over and over and over and over and over again. Oh, this is the gospel of Matthew. Just in case you forgot, this is the gospel of Matthew. This is the gospel of Matthew. They don't have to do that. They already established the 4 gospels. They had 4. That's it. And so if somebody read from the gospel of Matthew, the lectionary for the day or the reader of that congregation did not have to get up and constantly remind the church, oh, by the way, this was Matthew. It wasn't about that. My point was they knew the gospels came from the eyewitnesses. And they were the only 4 gospels being read in those churches. Why were those 4 gospels being read in those churches? Not 5, not 3. Why the same 4 in the churches in Africa, the churches in Europe, the churches in modern day Turkey, the churches in Israel, the churches in Antioch? Why is it that these churches were only reading through liturgically 4 gospels? And if you are in a liturgical church, you know this is a bad argument because we read the gospel readings every week with this phrase, the gospel of the Lord, because we don't have to clarify every single time who is in it. So the church isn't sitting there going, boy, I just hope this is real stuff. I just really hope somebody in there is reading something that actually came off the mouth of Jesus. Again, I don't have to clarify to you every single time that I'm from South Carolina, so the governor is Governor McMaster's. So I have to tell you that for you to believe me when I say I'm from South Carolina. You don't have to clarify the obvious corporate, already received common knowledge every single time you bring something up. You don't have to do that. So I think that this argument was kind of a bait and a switch, because we went from Tertullian, an argument I made earlier in the video, and now we turn over to something I made completely different about liturgical readings and why churches were not so concerned about the things that we're talking about right now, because it was common knowledge and already accepted. There's no point in beating the dead horse and constantly regurgitating the same things. These are 2 separate things that were blended into one. And he's saying he's saying I actually he's saying I answered myself, but I didn't answer myself, because what I was talking about in one context was completely different than the other context here. And it was completely never, and by the way, he never answered. He didn't answer the Tertullian part, and he didn't answer the liturgical part either. How is it that these churches are only liturgically reading 4 gospels, not 3, not 5, 4, and that in liturgy, you can look at the ancient lexical readings. We have lexicons everywhere in manuscripts. And you know what they don't do every single time you got done reading? This is the gospel of Matthew. This is the gospel of Mark. What you find commonly is this, the gospel of the Lord. That's what you find.
I mean,
and by the way, look no further than the Didache. Look no further than the Didache when it quotes the prayers from Matthew's gospel. What does it say right after it quotes the Lord's Prayer? As it is written in the gospel of the Lord. That's liturgical reading. That's even in the late 1st century. Sorry, I got worked up there. Yeah, go ahead.
No, it makes sense. I mean, every year, every week, they say, they do the gospel reading. They say, this is the word of the Lord. We say, thanks be to God. And that's it. Like, as you said, you don't have to state it to the people that already know who the authors are. So, all right, let's keep trudging along, and let me know when you want to stop.
At all. So tell us, Stephen, if the author names weren't important at first, when did they start getting used?
Yeah, tell us, Stephen. When did they start getting used? All right.
Because why did it have to be pushed with names on it? And I think that goes back to what I was saying a minute ago. You have common known things about these texts in the earliest stages. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Ignatius, a lot of things were already assumed in the 2nd century. And so
keyword.
once the text started becoming
Keyword assumed.
more distributed and further out to churches that did not have the assumed knowledge, it is mandated that they start actually putting more succinct identification to them when transmitting them and sending them out. Because the more audiences and the more churches that grow, and the further the gospel is going around the world, the less the assumed knowledge becomes, and it is paramount that those churches that are taking the letters they directly received from the apostles, because they knew the apostles, they spent time with the apostles, they were being taught and pastored by the apostles' own disciples. As that connection starts getting lesser and a new person comes in, or a new church over here and a new church over there, it becomes paramount that you actually become more clear on the assumed knowledge this community has, to make sure the next community has that same assumption, because they won't have the same assumption when in that same exact era, around that same time frame, Irenaeus, somebody starts threatening to bring in these other texts, or somebody like Marcion comes into play, or something of the Gnostics come into play. Now all of a sudden they are whipping out names. They are using names as authoritative, but they're not when they're writing in these other cases to the churches who already know what they're referring to, and to the unbelieving leaders who have no significant change to them when you use their names at all. It seems like the only time that they whip their names out and the usage the way they do is when they're having to defend them against internal works of so-called Christian groups bringing in other documents to rival. That's the only time they really ever have to whip their name.
You do understand, Stephen, that this, at first, no one
Yeah, Stephen, you do understand.
cared about the authors as long as it felt apostolic scenario, followed by the we had to start using names when new people stopped taking us at our word concession matches perfectly well with the names being a later addition rather than a persistent fact, right?
So
I think you were trying to make it.
So again, we just skipped over everything I said, that, and the key word, and I stopped it when you were, oh, well, you didn't stop it, but I said assumed. If common knowledge is given about a situation, and everybody in the community has that knowledge, the more that community mutates and grows and establishes its own communities outside of that community, things get lost in transmission. When people are challenging your documents, let's take Marcion again, who's now taking parts of Luke and actually removing them and mutilating them. That's when you see people have to get up and actually make the defense of clarification and detail about the document. Because now what was always known to be true of an audience and its belief and its connection, because they heard the apostles, they heard the disciples of the apostles, and now somebody on the outside is destroying your text, that's when you should expect to see high defenses of the Gospels. That's what Tertullian did. That's what the anti-Marcionite prologue was doing. That's what the Muratorian fragment was doing. All of a sudden, you're starting to see what he's saying, later names attributed. No, you're not seeing new attribute names. You're seeing different locational places use the same names without even talking to each other to defend the integrity of the original writer, saying, this is not what we have passed down to us. This is not what we have. This is not in our archives. This is not the way things were given to us. Marcion has corrupted the Gospel of Luke. Now you're hearing them say Luke over and over again, because now it's not a community of people who have assumed knowledge. Now you have outside people who don't have assumed knowledge. You have to clarify what has already been believed on for all of its time. Same thing is true when heretics come in and try to corrupt your text. Now you have to go in and validate what is true against what is being said to be true about your text, which is actually a lie. That's when you would expect people to bring out the details more significantly. What he's doing is he's trying to compare defending the Gospels against heresies and outside sources and corruptions to the common community of Christians who don't have to be educated about something they already know. And you're trying to say that both audiences, the heretics and the outsiders who are seeking harm to the text or to duplicate them with new names and new content, like the Gnostic Gospels, are equal to the knowledge of those who have received these letters by hand. Let's go back to Polycarp, shall we? What does he do? When he writes to the Philippians, he assumes, Michael, they already have that letter Paul wrote to them almost 80 to 90 years before. He assumes they have it. He assumes they can read it. He assumes they know where it came from. And he assumes that it has spiritual effects on their faith. Why is it that Polycarp, let's just say he wrote in the 140s, like some think, I think it's a little earlier. Let's just say it's the 140s. What if he wrote this letter in 140? Paul wrote the book of the Philippians earlier in his ministry. He's assuming 80 to 90 years later, they have the letter of Paul, its salutation, its instructions, and that 90, 80, 90 years later, they can pull it out of their archives and still read it and know where it came from. If Polycarp assumes that happened with Paul's letter, why should we assume any differently with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are four of the greatest treatises of the life, ministry, and teachings of Jesus in the entire church? See, this is where Paul did not answer anything I said in that long clip. Not a single bit of it. It is not on us, Michael, to produce the burden of proof that these are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John.
Right.
We are showing from the early stages of this where the documents were carefully handled, read as their public readings in scriptures. Justin Martyr says, what does he call them? The memoirs of the apostles. When it came time to actually have him to clarify one single time, he mentions it's the memoirs of Peter. When he had to, the rest of the time, he didn't have to do that. You're reading the memoirs of the apostles. Why didn't Justin have to do that? He assumes that everybody in his churches knows exactly what they're reading in their scripture readings of their public gatherings. It's when they had to go to war for these documents that now the anti-Marcionite prologue gives the whole historicity, and the Muratorian fragment gives the historicity of these texts, because now it's required of the church to pull out all of its archival records to defend its authenticity. And once these archival records are brought to the surface in Alexandria, in Antioch, and in Turkey, and in the West, all of a sudden, guess what? They're saying the same exact thing without even talking about. How did they come up with the same exact explanations without any cooperation at that point? Because they had the same history source of origination, and it was always assumed within the Christian communities. And as those communities grew, it required further explanation. So you're going to see a lot more. And by the way, this is true in the manuscript tradition. You can see this in places where scribes went further to explain things that were getting lost in transmission. I'll give you one perfect example really quickly. In John's Gospel, in chapter 5, you get to the story where Jesus heals the man who tried to rush into the pool, tried to get into the pool and get himself healed, because the legend was that an angel would come down, touch the waters. That is not in the earliest manuscripts of John. That is in a later development. And we see in some of the in some manuscripts that it is actually marginalized, whereas if the scribe was trying to explain why something like that would happen, because Jews had this theory that, well, people must have had some sort of healing, so an angel must have touched the water, when actually through excavation of that area finds out there was a bubbling spring there that had minerals coming out. We now know exactly what it was, but their theory was an angel did it. And a scribe later down the road, as time went on, felt like his audience was not going to understand why these people are so insanely trying to get into the waters first. He felt like he needed to clarify to his audience the why. Nobody before that needed to know the why, because they would have already known the legend. As legend starts getting lost to what people believed or thought at a certain point, and new audiences are coming in, clarification sometimes has to happen, and it happens later rather than in the assumed audience. And Paul did not answer that part.
Right. And so just in a nutshell, to summarize, the data is not consistent with Paul's hypothesis that these names were added at a later point when they felt a need to defend this from heretics like Marcion, because you would have got a variety of names. You would not have had unanimous attestation in various geographical regions, all saying the same thing. You wouldn't have Justin Martyr also giving us hints and pieces of evidence that also support traditional authorship, like saying that it was written by apostles and men who followed them, that the gospel attributed to the gospel that is of the memoirs of Peter mentions that he changed the names of James and John to the sons of thunder. Like, this all fits in line with traditional authorship. That would not fit with the idea these names were added later in an attempt to, because again, you would have had a variety of names like what we see with Hebrews. So, all right, let me keep going here. Let me know when you're ready to stop again.
Make an excuse for the poor data.
That's excusegetics.
But instead, you ended up helping the anonymous scenario seem even more plausible.
Kip Davis
Only if you take things out of context, Paul. Let's keep that in mind.
asked in the chat, I asked before and would love for the panel to answer this question. Is it in any way problematic if all four gospels are anonymous? So I would argue that the successful demonstration that traditional authorship is correct adds to our case for the credibility of the gospel accounts, but our case for that does not rest upon the traditional authorship.
I would answer that yes and no. If they were anonymous but traceable to the correct people. So what do we mean by anonymous? Because some would say that just some random groups of Christians compiled this. That's problematic. If they're actually apostolic figures and they were groups of the apostles and eyewitnesses who were leaders in the churches ordained by Jesus himself to do this, that's why I have no problem with Matthew being a group gospel, or that he wasn't the full-blown worker on his, or John on his.
Oh, I think it's time, Stephen. Tell us more about the Gospels being group projects.
Yeah, Stephen, tell us.
No, I just think it goes back to my perspective is that on the Gospels, 3 of them were worked on as a group. I know that
I agree.
my opinions differ from me. I think Mark is the only one that was not worked on as a group gospel.
None of these church fathers attribute their quotes to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. For instance, Justin Martyr, who provides the most quotations, attributes them all to the memoirs of the apostles.
And if the churches are understanding that these are the apostles' text, that's how the epistle of Diognetus is representing them. That's how Justin Martyr is representing them. That's how even the Didache is representing. It's the gospel of the Lord. The focal point of the gospel is the ministry and teachings of Jesus, his work, his life, his death, his burial, his resurrection, and his commission, and his authority being passed on to those who knew him. That's the way they're looking at it. And their works were what the churches were using. So to reference them as the memoirs of the apostles, to me, makes more sense if we understand that most of these gospels were a corroborated work amongst the group of the eyewitnesses putting them together.
So to be clear, you're affirming it makes the most sense from the data to say the earliest church fathers were avoiding attribution to single authors.
I think Matthew's work was a published work from Jerusalem that was a combination of multiple apostles, not an individual apostle. There may have been one framework of that. There might have been one champion to produce it.
Papias stated that Matthew's work was written in Hebrew, but our first gospel is an original, high-level Greek composition, not a translation. Linguists overwhelmingly agree on this point. Whatever collection of Hebrew sayings Papias attributed to Matthew, it certainly does not correspond to the work we now recognize as our first gospel.
We don't know
And
what
we've already
maybe the
debunked
earliest
that.
form of Matthew
We
looked like.
actually just recently debunked that with this whole donkey gate situation, that Matthew does have a lot of that. And see, to me, that was, and I forgot he said that. That's actually not true either. What the data shows is my theory and perspective of how Matthew came to be what it is actually spot on, because what Papias is telling us is that he did collect sayings in the Hebrew dialect, so Hebrew Aramaic, and that others translated as best as they could later. If the bulk work was given by Matthew, and Matthew was over, why is it problematic? If we go to the Muratorian fragment, I don't understand why it's problematic that a group gospel cannot be attributed to a main author. Let's take John. John was in his community of disciples and fellow friends, and Andrew's mentioned explicitly by name, right? You mentioned that earlier. They said that John should narrate these things according to how they remembered them. And it went into the plural. So John should be the main narrator, but you have other contributing voices that remember things too, that should be brought into the Gospel of John. But the question then becomes that Paul didn't answer is, why did they want John to do it? One, he was the main, one of the main three apostles still in the group. So you had Peter, James, and John. James was quickly executed. Peter is dead by this point. John's side of the story, at being at major events and places, was required of him to give an account of his gospel because he had insight that Peter didn't have. He had perspective that Peter didn't have. He had a different personality that Peter didn't have. So when you look at John, it makes the most sense that he, one of the inner three, would be the narrator of a group's voice going forward into a gospel. Matthew, on the other hand, Matthew had to corroborate with Peter's text. Why? Matthew is not there in the very beginning. Matthew is not there on the sermon or on certain places where Jesus took Peter, James, and John aside with Moses and Elijah, for example, on the Mount of Transfiguration. He was not there in the inner part of the garden when Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him. He was not the one that ran to the tomb. He was not one of the ones that went to the cross. He was not one of the ones that was at the campfire with Peter and listening in on the trial. So Matthew needed someone else to be there. This doesn't mean it's not Matthew's work. No more does it mean it's not Luke's work to have to investigate other eyewitnesses who were there for events he wasn't, take their testimonies, write it for them, and publish the Gospel of Luke as a group effort, but it was Luke who created the project to be published. Why does it point to anonymity if there's others like, and I'll give the names I mentioned, Athanasius and others mentioned that James and John and Barnabas, these are other names that are attributed to translating Matthew's gospel into a Greek published gospel. If that's true, and these names are attributed to the translation, these are eyewitnesses who are part of the project. Why is it a problem if Matthew had to use Peter, other eyewitnesses in the city of Jerusalem and Antioch to create a complete gospel for the church of Jerusalem, the mother church, to send out to the Greek churches a gospel from headquarters, and he be credited with that gospel since it was his early work that started the process, and it was his work of compiling to put the final product in play? That's still his gospel. That's still his work. It doesn't make it less Matthew's gospel, but what it means is that gospel was not and by the way, I'm glad that Luke investigated multiple people. I'm glad John gave voice to Andrew and Thomas, and we learned about things from Nathaniel that we didn't know before. We learned things about Philip we didn't know before. We learned things from Thomas we didn't know before. Thankful that he gave us the other voices of the apostles to speak. Judas, not Iscariot, gets a speaking line. I mean, we see others come in and get speaking parts that we don't see in the synoptic accounts that John includes. It doesn't make it less John's gospel when he's the main authority behind it. So when the churches are getting these gospels that are eyewitness based, or terminology of Justin Martyr, the memoirs of the apostles, here's what I think Justin was saying. Here's why I think Justin didn't clarify, because it wasn't just about Matthew. It was a group eyewitness account, the memoirs of the apostles of Jerusalem. In Luke's, it was the memoirs of the apostles and the eyewitnesses. John, it was the memoirs of John and Andrew and the other apostles. It was a collective. And would we want that anyway? I mean, would we not rather have gospels, Michael, in your opinion, that have a collective eyewitness base behind them? Yeah, we love Mark and it's just Peter, and Peter is a star witness. But aren't you, in your opinion, as a Christian, comforted by the idea that Luke didn't just talk to one guy? And that John actually did have others contributing? To me, this is not a problem. This actually creates a stronger case for why the early writers of the church were saying these are memoirs of the apostles, not just a single one. But if you have to start distributing it, and these churches are growing and people are corrupting it, at the end of the day, when Marcion corrupted Luke, even though he probably investigated Philip and and others who were there, like Cleopas was probably an eyewitness of his, why do you have to start defending Luke? Because Luke compiled the work. It was his work. It doesn't mean that he wasn't still mutilating works and testimonies of the individuals he investigated, but ultimately it is Luke's work. I don't know why that's hard to understand here.
No, and I think the main point to take away from this is just because we note that the way ancient documents were written, these were group projects, that doesn't mean they were originally anonymous. It doesn't mean there was not a main authority figure behind them, like with what the Muratorian fragment presents with John. John is sort of dictating this, but Andrew is there who's going to help and contribute. There are other brothers with them. John is probably not sitting in an office by himself. He's probably dictating to a scribe, as most ancient authors did. I mean, that's just what had happened. And the fact that Luke is, he's compiling this stuff, he's probably also going to work through a scribe, because if he had physician training, he would have known that's what you did. And he would have collected all these eyewitnesses, made notes, and then put it together, probably with the help of others around him who were in Rome at the time, who had also spoken with eyewitnesses, like Paul, for example. But that does not mean that he is still not the authority figure behind it. So it's not this either or. We can say that these were group projects, just like I say Paul's letters were group projects. But there's still a main authority figure behind it.
Yeah, he mentions Timothy being with them. We're writing to you. Yeah.
Yeah, but so many of it. So yeah, this is just, I think it's just missing the point, and it's oversimplifying things that are scholars will notice just far more complex. Yes, Cicero wrote his letters through Tyro, who often did a lot of the bulk work for Cicero because that's what his job was as a scribe.
Like, I personally believe he collected sermons of Jesus that consisted of the major ones, like the Olivet Discourse, Sermon on the Mount, prayers like the Lord's Prayer. These would have been things that Matthew would have recorded initially on, just collecting major things that the churches were using and reciting. Then it required a better and a more full account to be distributed from Jerusalem, which would have been other eyewitnesses and apostles that were still abiding in the city at that time. And they would have corroborated together and just real quick, we have indications of this with Matthew, that other people had their hands on the account. We have records of Barnabas. We have records of James the Just. We have records. I mean, we have multiple statements in history that other individuals that we would associate with the Church of Jerusalem and Antioch who had their hands on this.
So to be clear, you agree with my video in that whatever collection of Hebrew sayings Papias attributed to Matthew, it certainly does not correspond to the work we now recognize as our first gospel.
Well, what's interesting is that his view of this gospel of Matthew, whether it was the Matthew we have or not, or something similar or something attested to him, whatever your opinion is, it seems to be slightly different. And so my perspective is not the view that Matthew is written completely in Hebrew, all the sections, teachings, and everything that we have today, and then all of it was translated over to Greek. I don't think that's what happened. I think that there was a smaller account that was compiled by Matthew that was in the original languages and I think it was a combination.
Okay, so you agree with me that the evidence shows at best that Papias was referring to some kind of proto-Matthew document and not our gospel. Given that, in what kind of world is Matthew the author of Matthew?
So no, Matthew would not just throw his name singularity into the text if other people did actually have their hands on the text, like some of the early, like Epiphanius tells us about this. We have others that remark that even John the Apostle himself may have been involved in the Gospel of Matthew. So if that's the case, that's my thing is if it wasn't a singular person, why would they singularity insert their name? The question then becomes is why does a single name get associated with Matthew? If he did the groundwork for it and it began with his initial research, he would be getting the credit for it, just like John got the credit for the Gospel of John because he was the main narrator. She just took credit from my son.
So you agree Matthew wasn't the author, but possibly a contributor or an important source. That's a very different claim on the table now.
When you're looking at
that's not what he said. That's not what you said. So that's totally just taking you right out of context there.
Yeah, he is. If he compiled some of the major teaching points of Jesus as the original content that was being distributed in the churches, and then the Church of Jerusalem saw the necessity of getting all of this out particularly to the Greek churches, it took more than himself to do this. It took the funding, it took the aid, it took the scribal work. It doesn't make it less Matthew because now he is working with the context of Peter's testimony, or anybody else that was there getting information from James the Just about Mary or lineage. That's probably possibly where he got the lineage of Jesus from. It's probably from James the Just, who was in that same bloodline. It would make sense that he would need them to finish what he started originally to have a collection for the churches. Because what we see earlier quoted in Matthew is the sayings, it is the parables, it is the prayers. Those are the things that the early church is using from, or were using from the Gospel of Matthew. So again, I'm a little bit taken back that his conclusion was that I'm saying we don't have a Matthew attributed to gospel to the gospel here, except in a proto-Matthean form. Yes, I'm saying there's a proto-Matthean form that Papias is talking about. And I'm saying that the form that Irenaeus is talking about that was transmitted over in the time when Paul and Peter were in Rome starting churches, which would be in the 60s, that Matthew sometime from very, very early of the 30s, 40s collected things, now has a completed gospel that is done in the 60s, and that we have others who are coming behind saying, yes, there was a translation that happened in Matthew's gospel. We have names thrown out like James, John, and Barnabas, who were there in Antioch and Jerusalem, who are doing this translating work. Papias made a statement that others translated later the best that they could. I think that's what Papias was talking about. What I'm doing is actually showing that what Papias said and the church fathers say are not contradictory. They are actually flowing out in time and space in a realistic way, that there was this one section of Matthew that progressively made itself through the churches as the teachings of Jesus, the prayers of Jesus, the sermons of Jesus. And it wasn't enough for the Greek churches because these would have been collected in Hebrew language situations where the churches there in the Greek world would never have been able to understand them in those languages. And it needed to be in a Greek language that was universally used across the Roman Empire. And therefore, it pushed the Church of Jerusalem to get this message of Jesus from headquarters church to the other churches. And we see evidence of the church sending things out from headquarters Jerusalem. Look no further than the Council of Jerusalem. They wrote letters to the churches as instruction of what to do after they've made decisions. It would make sense that headquarters church would send out a gospel in Greek, not Hebrew.
Yeah, and also, I mean, this is, if you read scholars like Craig Evans, Craig Blumberg, Charles Quarles, they're saying the same thing, that Matthew wrote something in Hebrew, like a collection of sayings, and then he, in the 60s or something after that, got a copy of the Gospel of Mark, and he realized that this was a gospel written for Gentiles, and he said, well, let me take it with what I wrote in the sayings, combine it with what we got here from Peter, and let's make a gospel that is evangelizing to Jews abroad. So, I mean, like, yeah, numerous scholars have argued this. That it's not just you alone. It's others have said, yeah, Matthew wrote something in Hebrew, and then the final gospel was written in Greek, but drawing on some Hebrew document. And we'll cover this in the video I think we have coming out in July.
And again, the statement he made about there's no evidence of it being translated over is just, it's not true. Allison documented, and you showed it, whatever, 5.5 pages. We have multiple.
It's just under 5 pages of Semitisms in Matthew's gospel that indicate, they argue it indicates Matthew knew Hebrew and probably Aramaic. Charles Quarles in his commentary uses evidence like this and other aspects to show that some parts of Matthew's gospel clearly go back to some sort of Hebrew.
Yep. And I think that's the part of where we can say this is probably where the original collection of Matthew was, and where it's not doing that, we can see where editors in that group of people put it out. And one of the biggest ones we talked about was the Donkey Gate situation on Palm Sunday. So, and if your crowd missed that, they can go back and watch that. It's on your channel.
Because the earliest stages of the Gospels, it wasn't so much focused on the author as much as the group that produced and authorized them.
So neat. You agree with my contention that the Gospels, at least 3, show clear signs of being compilations from prior sources. You admit this is what the data shows. Great.
Yes.
That means traditional authorship, the way the average evangelical holds to it, is completely off the table. That's a huge...
Whoa.
Yes.
And this is, we are trying to
Here,
train.
I'll just say really quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just say really quickly. Yes, because the traditional evangelical will think that just Matthew went in his office, wrote a gospel, came out, like just drawing from his memory. The traditional evangelical will think Mark did the same thing and Luke did the same thing. That, Matthew and Luke didn't use Mark. Like, yes, we're saying that. Of course, what we're saying is the traditional evangelical is wrong because there's a lot more complexity. But Paul's responding to us, not the traditional evangelical. So why bring it up?
Yeah, we're not making the average evangelical claim. In fact, speaking of facts, if you go to my podcast, Facts, you will find me and oftentimes my co-host regularly criticizing the ignorance of modern evangelical Christianity and the stuff that comes out of it. We have called it out. We have deconstructed a lot of it. We have criticized the ignorance in it. You don't have, look, just maybe Paul hasn't had a chance. Just check out a few episodes that I do on the modern evangelical church and their perspectives of things. And you'll find out really quickly that my goal is to deconstruct that nonsense and take the basic, simple explanations of things that are just beyond anything academic, critical thinking. And I personally spend most of my time with my co-host Tyler deconstructing that stuff. So we're not arguing.
Anybody who's watching, the podcast is linked I pinned it in a comment in the live chat after the stream. If you're watching after, I will link it below in the video description. Forgot to put it in this time, but yeah, it's right now in the live chat. I pinned a comment because I forgot earlier.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. But again, if anybody watches anything or listens, if you listen to it on the podcast or you watch it on the YouTube live streams, you will see me on a regular basis criticizing modern evangelical Christians for the ignorant comments and the simplicity of these things that are more in depth than what they want it to be. And they're refusing to accept certain difficult things because it's uncomfortable for them. Part of my job as a Christian who has studied in this is to get the church uncomfortable and have these kind of hard discussions because we can't avoid them anymore. I've been the biggest critic of that, of more than any atheist could ever, of the modern evangelical church. So much so that my journey is leaving the modern evangelical church, going into the Anglican communion and being a part of something more ancient and focusing on the historical Christianity, not some modern made up thing. So you don't have to look any further than Stephen Boyce to find a critic of the modern evangelical thinking.
I mean, I don't say what church I attend, but I do say I do attend a high church, and a similar story than you. I just had to get it out of evangelicalism. And one of the issues with several issues led me to that. One of them was dealing with Torah observers. And then I read church fathers and I was like, not only are the Torah observers wrong, it seems the evangelicals are wrong in a lot of ways too from reading church fathers. But one of the other reasons I left evangelicalism was I just didn't feel a lot of reverence in the church for the Eucharist or communion. Correct. And I was like, I got to be in a place that, treats this more sacred. All right, let's get to some super chats here because I've not addressed them for a while. This is some serious IP-ception. How deep can we go? Listen, we'll go deeper. That didn't come out right. I shouldn't say that. Look, I'm fine going another layer deep. I think this is a fun conversation, and I'm always happy to do live streams, especially now that YouTube's promoting them like crazy. So yeah, I'm all happy. I'll be on my channel again tomorrow with David Wood responding to Sheikh Uthman on an issue. So yeah, I'm always fine to keep going. Yeah. Hebrews proves not known authors would result in debates about authorship. Multiple theories came out of the early church. This is a good counter. Yes. And there's not been a good response from the skeptic on this. If they were just making up traditional authorship at the end of the 2nd century or mid-2nd century, they would have done the same thing for Hebrews. They would have done the exact same thing, and we would have had this variety. But we don't have variety with the Gospels. We have different authors separated by geographical differences, all agreeing this goes back to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, when Marcion tries to sneak in an anonymous gospel. If they were anonymous, when Marcion was doing this, they would have come up with all sorts of different authors. Again, it's not just one author. It's the argument we make is from the corroborating evidence.
Mhm.
We can be a little skeptical when we hear different theories about which gospel was written first. Like Clement says it was Matthew and Luke, then Mark. Irenaeus seems to say Matthew, then Mark, then Luke. We can be skeptical about where they were written, who was with them, like was Papias actually transcribing for John?
Right.
But one of the things is, in all of these traditions, they're all still agreeing it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the authority figures behind these. If you show up to a crime scene and you got one witness saying some guy robbed the convenience store, he was wearing a red hat, and he had this weird mustache, and he was some white guy. If you have another person say, no, he wasn't wearing a hat, he did have a mustache, and he used a knife, and yeah, he was white. If you have another one saying, well, I don't remember anything about what he was wearing, I just remember seeing a white guy. I can be unsure if he was wearing a hat, if he had facial hair, but I know it was a white guy because you have corroborating evidence. That's the exact same logic we apply to traditional authorship. We can be unsure about when each gospel was written. We can be unsure about who was with them. But given the corroborating evidence, it all points to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's a strong indicator that despite the fact they contradict on other issues, they still agree on this. So I don't see how the skeptic can really get around that at the end of the day. Sure, they can not be convinced. Paul was perfectly welcome to not be convinced, as he says. But I'm going to follow the evidence, and this is the best explanation at the end of the day.
And by the way, if you want a good explanation of why the gospel or why the epistle of Hebrews was written the way it was and who was possibly behind it, go to my podcast. I give a whole explanation about all that.
Well, I'm sure.
Sorry, that was a side plug.
Let's see here. Hi, P. Could you give a list of your favorite books? Have you considered making a video about it? Thanks for your previous advice and all that you do. It depends on what topic. I mean, and I'd have to sit there and think. I do have on my website, inspiringphilosophy.org, a recommended reading list for people that want to start out in certain subjects. So start there is what I would say on that. And if you want, like, you know, if you want, I don't know, it depends on what topic you're looking at. But again, if you go to the videos I do, and you just like, if you want to look like, you know, the video I got coming out on Mark, I'm going to cite a bunch of books you can read on reliability of Mark. So probably I'm going to cite the books I think you should use on the topic in the videos. And there's sometimes I put so many quotes in my videos just so you have additional sources you can go check. Because sometimes I feel like I'm being too quotey, but I think it's good that you see there are other sources that back this up and it's like a way for me to say, hey, additional material to read. Why does it seem that most critics of Christianity either distort or outright lie about things they are discussing? Lies more form the Dawa clowns. What are your thoughts on that, Ezra? Or Stephen, what are your thoughts on Ezra's super chat?
I don't know if that's a fair assessment. I'm sure there are people that are in that crowd that are maliciously evil. I really believe that they believe what they're saying. They want to believe what they're saying. Christians can have the same problem. This is an issue in both circles where we can come to believe a narrative or be closed-minded to certain aspects, and we hold tightly to the one that we are most comfortable with, and we defend it at all costs, which is what we get accused of all the time. I would say that it happens in both camps. It happens on their end too. One of the hardest things that I'm sure you've had to do this as well, Michael, is have an open mind and be willing to change. And this is what needs to be understood. My position in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John before I did all my research and study and schoolwork through it is very, very different where I land today, and far more detailed. And like I have changed so much of what I believe about the New Testament the further I've gone into this. So I don't think that these guys are necessarily right out lying. I think that they're misled. And then when they're presented with the evidence, they have to choose what to do with it. And they choose to handle it, in my opinion, not the best way, because just like Christians, they have a position, they have a narrative, and they have to defend it. And sometimes we can fall into that too. And I don't want to just pose that on one crowd.
Yeah, I would completely agree with you. I try to be charitable. I'm not perfect, obviously. And when I mess up, I try to apologize. But, you know, again, I don't think we could say they're all right out distorting or lying. I just think we disagree on a lot of things. And my problem is when they try to make it more personal. Oh, well, you're doing this because you're an apologist, or you're just making excuses. Be an adult, show some respect. Don't just reduce everything to that. Engage with the arguments. I do this on TikTok and Instagram. I respond to some stuff I think is just quite outright dumb. Like I had to respond to somebody one time claiming that he said flat mountains are giant tree stumps from the ancient world, and I'm like, you mean plateaus? No, I'm still going to at least engage with what he's saying, even if I make some jokes along the way. And so, like sometimes, when I get a video like to respond to, and he's saying things like Constantine created Christianity, I go, okay, let me at least represent this as best I can before I debunk it, because at least I'm going to engage with it and not just say, go read a book, moron. Like, let's try to do that. And so, I just want everyone to be more respectful. And I've even gone after Christians for not doing that. I knew it. This guy is not debating Christians. He is fighting the fundamentalists. Atkin described this mentality the same as Ehrman on his debate. Yeah, I think Paul does have a lot of grievances with fundamentalism. He came out of fundamentalism, but I agree he seems to be more going after the fundamentalist understanding of these issues, which both Steve and I agree needs to change. We need to adjust our thinking on that. But, our argument is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater here. There's plenty of good evidence for gospel authorship and gospel reliability here that we can put forward, where we get rid of the fundamentalist way to look at this. If it was good enough for the King James, was good enough for Paul, it's good enough for me mentality. But
which I grew up in, by the way.
Wow. Yeah. I didn't even grow up in that. It was not that bad. I grew up in more of a young earth creationist church.
Oh, I did that
church,
too.
but
oh yeah, absolutely. The whole, yeah. Oh yeah. Women can't wear pants. I grew up in that. Yeah, it was nuts. Is that actually $129? Is that $129 or is that's
Mexican dollars? So
okay, I see. Okay.
You got to do the change. It's probably like $5, the way inflation is and currency
$5
exchange.
is good.
Yeah. I'd be nice, but I mean, anyone wants to throw out $129 super chat, you're more than welcome. I will answer.
We'll take time to answer that one.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, my church wasn't that bad. You could wear pants. You could read other Bibles other than the King James, but it was still a little fundamentalist in how it was, in the way it sort of acted. But yeah, I think a lot of atheists, their real enemy or their real anger is towards fundamentalism.
It is.
That actually, and if you study the sociology, that's where a lot of problems come in, sociologically speaking. That leads to all sorts of negative behaviors. But intrinsic religiosity or Christian orthodoxy does not on its own. So I agree with a lot of the atheists in their fight against fundamentalism. The problem is that they think that just sort of spills over into what you or I do, or just Christianity at large, which the fundamentalists really in the sociological aspect don't represent even the majority of Christians out there. So there's a lot more fundamentalism in Islam than there is in Christianity, and various studies do show that. So yeah, I think that's a lot of the problems. But I mean, again, Paul still raises objections. He's not an idiot. He brings up good points that need to be addressed, and we'll make our excuses to deal with them as we do. Meant to say, this is from Ezra's earlier comment on the critics of Christianity. So this is him adding to this comment here. He says, meant to say, I see more outright lies from the Dawa guys. Yeah, I'll give you that. Stephen doesn't deal a lot with the Da'i, the Muslim apologists.
I'll leave that for you, sir.
Oh, you don't know what you're missing, man. I have never been less convinced of a religion in my life. When I started dealing with Islam, I was like, I can't tell you how many times I've looked at a Muslim video just like, are you being serious, or are you like an undercover Christian apologist trying to make Islam look bad? Like there are actual Muslims that think that some of the people I've debated are actual like undercover like government agents just trying to make Islam look bad. I had to respond to some guy called the Muslim Cowboy who was trying to argue for Muhammad's marriage to Aisha at age 9. And he pulls out a Bible and he goes, why are you Christians complaining? Genesis 21 and 22 teaches Rebecca was 3 when she married Isaac. And it's like,
oh Lord,
you read the book in front of you, dude. How bad are you at this? Like, this is just, like, he was so cocky and so serious. Like, so serious about this, but he didn't even read the Bible in front. I mean, like, sometimes
all
I talk
yours,
with
bud.
atheists and they go,
It's all yours.
I talk with atheists and sometimes we go, listen, we don't agree, but at least we recognize we're not like the Muslim apologists, the Salafis. So what are your opinions on demonology and if it is a legitimate function of a pastor or priest? What's supporting parts of the Bible? What's supporting parts of the Bible to your opinion? I don't know. What are your thoughts, Stephen?
Oh, I mean, I think it's real. We have just the Roman Catholic Church alone has endless documentation of eyewitness testimonies of exorcists and things like that. Do I believe it's real? Sure. There's multiple reports of these kinds of things. I have my deep rooted opinion about all that isn't worth our time on this show because it'd be taking away from the main thing. But as a basic answer, my opinion is it's real as a legitimate function. I do believe that priests have authority and position and through the power of God to actually release people from demonic oppression or possession. And it's ironic actually that question was asked. I witnessed this with my own eyes just recently, within arm's reach of a person, not possessed, but oppressed, where the priest actually prayed certain prayers and things like that. And the person was instantly relieved of a massive body, went into tense mode, convulsion, kind of just struggle and pain and all over situation that was instantly removed. So do I believe it? Sure. I've seen it with my own eyes, and we have countless records of this thing, of these kinds of things being true. So I have no reason to deny it at all. Does the Bible support it? The Bible talks about demon possession all the time. Jesus was casting out demons. His apostles were casting out demons. People were being oppressed constantly. Paul said, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers. So if that's our warfare, then certainly people are going to be oppressed, and some people possibly even possessed by demons in the world. And sure, yeah, I have no problem believing it from that standpoint, from a scriptural and from a data standpoint.
Speaking of Islam, I did a response to someone on TikTok who was in the occult, and he said he's becoming a Muslim because he contacted spirits and he did occult rituals so that they could not lie to him, and they started teaching him the Quran. Wait, what? What did you just say? I was like, oh, this is getting reposted. I'm going to show this to everyone. But I don't know if he was lying. I don't know if he was being accurate, but it was a very interesting thing to say. And I also found it interesting that Muslims were setting him up as another da'i and not putting him on a pedestal for this. I was shocked. But yeah, I think it's real. I've never witnessed any of that, and I think it's exceptionally rare. So I'm very skeptical when these things come up. But again, it's not my real area to dive into.
Yeah, I don't think it's like a standard or something, but I think we have enough evidence to show that there's realities.
I hear you both, but at times Derek Bowen or Paulogia, as Stephen said earlier, all seem very deceitful and disingenuous at times, even after we being confronted. What are your thoughts on that, Stephen?
So yeah, by the way, it wasn't meant to be like a harsh criticism on Paul. I just noticed that a lot of people like pronounce his name differently, so I figured I'd add maybe one that hasn't been done yet. So, but yeah, so Derek Bowen, so that's Josh. Derek, I guess from Myth Vision. Paul seemed very deceitful, disingenuous at times. I've debated Dr. Bowen, and I know Derek pretty well, and so do you. Not as much about Paul, but I really don't think they are. I don't think they're deceitful. I really believe they genuinely hold their position to what they believe and why they believe it. And again, a lot of these guys came out of what Michael was talking about a minute ago. They were a part of very fundamental Christian groups. I mean, I've talked to Derek personally, and he's shared circumstances and stories when he was in a youth group and asking questions and treated a certain way. I sympathize with their disgust, but I really don't believe they are intentionally. And if they are, then God's their judge. But I think they really
Right.
believe what they believe. I really believe that what they believe is true, and that they're fighting an injustice. And it came out in the video with Paul. He just rebuked an entire modern evangelical crowd for the arguments they hold of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which we haven't in 2 videos made one argument in that favor. So that to me showed us what they're really getting at, what's at the heart of this. And it went beyond us. It went against an ideology or a concept that has been imposed on the Christian communities for a long time. And people like him are just sick of it. We're sick of it too. We just chose to do something different about it.
Right. Thoughts on Sneeko getting owned at Speaker's Corner? I've not seen that clip yet. I'll try to take a look. I got so many things I got to get to, but I'm trying to finish up some books I'm reading on the Gospel of John right now. So I've been focusing on that. So I don't know if you've seen it, Stephen.
I have not.
Yeah, I've not seen it. So sorry, we'll move on. If the trajectory continues as it does, Islam dies. Yeah, and David Wood has cited a lot of evidence that a lot of sheikhs and imams are worried about this thing they're calling the avalanche of apostasy in Islam. And you can see things like anonymous polls coming out of Iran showing that some like half or so of people still identify as Muslim when they're being asked when they can be anonymous. And Iran's closing a bunch of mosques, and you see Pakistan is committing a lot of blasphemy against Muhammad online. So interesting things are happening, but I don't know how far it really goes, because it's hard to get these accurate numbers out of the Islamic world when you have apostasy laws and you can be killed for leaving your religion, unlike in the West, where things can be a little bit more scientific and accurate. Did God really create planets before the sun? No. See my Genesis 1-11 series.
You've answered that.
I put all the videos I did in a playlist on my channel called Genesis 1-11. I go through all that in detail. I don't think planets were created before the sun.
And Dr. Hugh Ross does a lot of work on that as well. I'm a contributing scholar for RTB, by the way. Just recently been accepted in their program. But he has written extensively on that. In addition to, you've done a couple of videos, to my knowledge, about that. So, hey, there's a lot of work on that. Very good work on that.
Yeah. On Heretics by St. John of Damascus is still a great primer on the issue with Islam. Also, is this just going to be a back and forth between you and Paulogia until one stops? Well, yes. I love this stuff. I would love to keep talking about it. If Paul wanted to have a dialogue with me, he's going to have a dialogue with Stephen soon. I'd be more than happy to. I'd jump at that in a heartbeat. For me, it's just scheduling and making sure I can fit everything in there. But I would definitely try to fit that in, even if it's months scheduled out.
Yeah, St. John of Damascus is excellent, by the way. And in the rise of Islam and his right against the Ishmaelites, he calls them the false going into the false children of Abraham. It's tremendous. Read John of Damascus. Very good.
Berserk fan comes back and says, "Fair, I came from a fundy light background myself." Yeah, I'd say the same for myself. Can I do a video on how I believe God is 3 in 1 for you to review it in a video? So sick of being ignored by the in crowd. Why keep living? I'm not sure who you are, President Christopher. I literally wake up and I have 50 emails and plus messages across various it's hard for me to get to everything at this point in my life. I don't know if I can. I don't know what the in crowd is. If you want to grow on YouTube, work on your thumbnails, do shorts, get a high quality mic and camera, just try to grow that way. I've never tried to be in an in crowd. If that's your goal, you shouldn't be doing YouTube. My goal was never to be in a crowd. My goal was to put videos out to help people as best as I possibly can. And that's what we all should be doing at the end of the day. So sorry, I don't know if I would even have time for that. I got so much on my plate as it is. It's hard for me to get to every message, every response, everything. I got a question.
Man, there's a lot of super chats. Wow.
Yeah. People wonder why I don't get to all the messages. I can barely get to all the super chats. I got a question. It might be dumb, but I've always wondered why in Genesis 1 verse 2, why does it say the Spirit of God and why not just God? Actually, I think the commentators today note it's like a wind of God. So it doesn't say that the Spirit of God. It says there was like a wind of God blowing on the face of the water. So it would still be God. It's referring to like something that he has done in nature specifically. I believe Paul Copan talks about that in his book on Genesis that he wrote with Douglas Jacoby. I know Robert Alter talks about that in his commentary, and it's this white and gold commentary here. So check that out. He's also got one on just Genesis, which is just basically the commentary from Genesis that's been included in that big commentary over there. So, all right, with that, I think we got through all the super chats. We did it, Stephen. Is there anything else you wanted to say on the Paul video, or do you want to close this out?
No. I look forward to having a conversation with him. Maybe we'll get some clarification, and I'm curious to see his response after we have a conversation and everything's put on the table to clarify. That's a nice thing about doing those. When you actually are engaging in the moment, it's hard to like misrepresent somebody, because maybe we're misrepresenting him a little bit, and that can't happen in a one-on-one. Maybe I know he's misrepresenting me. So yes, there's a lot of misrepresentation going on. So maybe this will clear a lot of that up.
Yeah, and I fully agree with that. And again, the purpose of this stream, I want to reiterate, which I said in the beginning, was basically, it seemed like you were misrepresented. This should be a good chance for you to clarify your position, clarify what we think Paul is saying at this point, so that you can go into that conversation with Paul and have a better conversation than him just kind of being blindsided by some of this stuff. And I think that's a far better thing to see than you both just sort of going in there and talking past each other the whole time. One last super chat, and then I'm going to close this out. Love your videos. You've helped me so much with topics like spirituality, irreducibility of the mind, and free will. Appreciate it. Well, much appreciated. Thank you for your Australian monopoly money. I'm joking, but thank you very much for the super chat. Much appreciated. All right. With that, tomorrow I should be on my channel again with David Wood at this exact time. So 5 Pacific time. Since it's Easter, we plan to review a video recently by Sheikh Uthman claiming, you're going to love this, Stephen. You ready for this? I'm glad you're sitting down. But Sheikh Uthman is arguing there's no good evidence that would convince him that Jesus was crucified.
Oh,
not that Jesus resurrected. He was arguing that there's no evidence. He wants historic evidence that Jesus was crucified.
I wonder if he accepts Tacitus' statement as authentic. Interesting.
I don't think he's going to accept evidence. Let's just be honest. If you're denying that Jesus was crucified, you're not really interested in evidence. Let's be honest here. And this is what I was talking about earlier. Some of the Muslim apologists are really something else.
Bless your heart.
All right. Bless your heart. Exactly. All right. I'll see you guys tomorrow on my channel, and David Wood should be back with me. All right. See you guys next time.